Omelek, September 2008. The air felt thin, like the island had been vacuum sealed. We were jammed shoulder to shoulder in a plywood war room that hummed with old fans and fresh fear, eyes glued to a jittering CRT that turned the sky into static and countdown digits. 3 failures already, each one carving a notch in the budget, in morale, in the story we told our families about why we were never home. Elon stood half a step behind the front row, hands flat on the table, knuckles whitening whenever the range officer's voice cracked. Personal cash was almost gone, vendor patience was gone, jokes were gone. If this one died, so did we. T-minus 30 seconds. Someone killed the AC, the room got hotter anyway. T-minus 20 seconds. The pad camera shook a little in the trade winds on screen. The vehicle looked too small to carry the weight we'd loaded onto it. Physics, payroll, 1,000 tiny IOUs. T-minus 12 seconds. No one breathed. Somewhere, a pen clicked and then didn't. T-minus 5 seconds. We didn't pray, we audited. Turbo pumps, valves, stage latches, software that had eaten every weekend since spring. Sero. Light bloomed. The speakers coughed. The room stayed perfectly still, like movement itself might jinx combustion. For one suspended beat, we lived between arithmetic and luck. Rewind.
Welcome to Quiet Capital. What you're about to hear is not a profile or a verdict. It's a field note, rescued from late nights and launch mornings, from factory floors chalked with shoe prints and Palo Alto kitchens lit by laptop glow. We keep an archive for moments like this, when a single decision threads together money, physics, and the stubborn will of a person who refuses to be statistically average. The voice you'll hear belongs to a friend who stood close enough to smell scorched epoxy and burnt coffee, close enough to watch meetings turn into wagers, and wagers into companies. He was there when maps became software, when payments became a platform, and when rockets stopped being a punchline. Inside these pages, the camera isn't looking up at genius or down at myth. It's level with a chair at a crowded table. There are names redacted and numbers intact. There are jokes that didn't age and ledger lines that did. If you listen for it, you'll hear the rhythm that runs through all of it. Break the problem to atoms. Price the atoms. Reassemble without superstition. Here is the hook and the hinge. Within these pages lies the minute a company and a man bet the last dollar on physics. We begin at T0 because that is where the heart argues with the spreadsheet, and both must be right. Exhibit number 1. Exhibit number 1 sits in a thin acetate sleeve, a crooked photocopy of a whiteboard corner, the kind you run off at 1 a.m. before the custodian kills the lights. Marker ghosts everywhere, math half erased, initials, arrows. But your eye can't look anywhere except the circle. Someone drew it in red grease pencil, which the copier rendered as a heavy charcoal ring. Inside the ring, blunt as a verdict. T3. The T didn't mean time. It meant tries. 3 of them. 3 failures tallied like notches on a hull. The copy still shows the tape shadow from where the original was pinned above a cramped desk. Printer paper curling. Corners feathered by the AC. People bumped into it carrying laptops. No one moved it. It migrated instead. From the kitchen door to a lab column to the war room wall. The ring darkening with every relocation, acquiring the gravity of a superstition we pretended we didn't have. Teams start to hear numbers. Investors do too. So do vendors. T3 became a metronome in the back of the building, a reminder that rockets don't fail once. They fail, and then they echo, through morale, through terms, through time. We will decode why that circle stopped being a warning and became a hinge around minute 20. Chapter 1. The World Before.
By the time most of Palo Alto woke up, he'd already logged a second morning. Zip 2 wasn't a company so much as a mattress on an office floor with a coax line snaking past our pillows. The building's fluorescent lights hummed like bees at night. They felt like weather. We showered at the YMCA with quarters in a Ziploc, folded back into the same clothes, then bicycled to a coffee shop that tolerated refills as long as our laptops didn't steal outlets. He didn't do small talk, he did problem statements. A city is just a graph, he'd mutter, drawing intersections as nodes and businesses as weighted edges, then ask which traversal returned revenue fastest. We pounded on city guide pages until our fingertips went slick, copy-pasting addresses, cleaning phone numbers, arguing about taxonomy like it was theology. Midday, we'd cold call metro dailies and pitch digital classifieds with maps, a phrase that sounded expensive and, crucially, survivable. Nights were a loop, code, crash, reheat, repeat. He loved what others called impossible, because you could measure progress against it. We taped printouts to the wall queries per second, contracts in pipeline, latency shaved off the search box, and crossed them out with a blunt Sharpie when they moved. Once, a reporter tried to profile us, and he spent the entire interview whiteboarding URL structure, forgetting the human part of the story even existed. But the work had a gravity to it. When the first city signed, the room didn't cheer, it exhaled. "Good," he said, already tabbing to a spreadsheet. "Now make it trivial to add the next 10. Under buzzing lights and takeout steam, we learned the day-to-day texture of building. The parts list for Momentum is ugly, iterative, and profoundly unglamorous, and he was perfectly at home inside it. The first real newspaper deal came in on a Friday fax, red lines, coffee rings, a signature page that looked like it had been through a rainstorm of lawyers. We'd argued for weeks about price and control, fixed fee versus rev share, exclusivity by ZIP versus MSA, whether their CMS would mangle our map tiles beyond recognition. He negotiated like an engineer to find the interface, then refused to support undefined behavior. "If we let one small exception in, we're maintaining it forever," he said, crossing out a clause that gave them veto power over product changes. In the war room, we had a running debate that never really ended. Were we a directory with ads or an operating layer for cities? He wanted platform, APIs, ingestion pipelines, a one-click city spin-up. A few of us, tired and broke, wanted billables and quiet. When the publisher finally signed, we allowed ourselves 10 seconds to grin. Then he said, "Great." That was the ante. He clicked open a spreadsheet and doubled the column labeled Next 10. The lesson arrived with our first grown-up investor. He brought a new board member who brought a phrase we hadn't heard before: adult supervision. Titles reshuffled, meeting agendas began with finance rather than product. We discovered how governance can rewire a company faster than code. One afternoon after a board prep, I found him alone at the whiteboard redrawing our org as if it were a network diagram. "Control is latency," he said. "Add hops, lose responsiveness." We shipped anyway, but something essential had been learned. A chair can be pulled out mid-sentence, even if you built the table. From then on, every contract and cap table note felt like a component: spec tolerance, failure modes, and who held the wrench. Compaq bought Zip 2 for $307 million, and the number hit the room like a pressure change. Ears pop. Lights sharpen. Everyone speaks a little faster. Bank accounts fatten, calendars do too. Reporters call. Recruiters call. Distant cousins remember your birthday. He didn't celebrate, he decompressed the problem. Liquidity, to him, wasn't a finish line, it was a solvent. It dissolved excuses and left behind the next constraint in clean outline. For a week, he wandered the office like a tourist who'd arrived after the parade, tapping on monitors, asking if the search box could have been 40 milliseconds faster, then stopping mid-sentence to sketch a new box labeled money that moves like email. Restlessness set in the way, weather does gradual. Then suddenly you're drenched. He'd learned something sour but durable from the late-stage board dance. The chair can vanish mid-flight, and when it does, product velocity drops like a stage without ignition. So the next bet couldn't just be bigger, it had to be structured. Fewer hops in the decision network, tighter control surfaces. If cities were graphs, so were companies, and he meant to weight the edges. He started calling it X, not a brand yet, a variable. Payments stripped to atomic transfers, recomposed without the fees and friction that legacy players called policy. He wanted a bank that behaved like software, a wallet that behaved like a socket. The spreadsheets got a new tab. The mattress on the floor got ignored again. We weren't rich, we were refueled and pointed at the next burn.
Chapter 2. Mechanism. Part A.
First principles, in his mouth, Wasn't philosophy, it was a wrench. You strip a problem to parts you could weigh, heat, or price, then rebuild only what reality requires. With maps, he refused. That's how directories do it. A city, he'd say, is coordinates plus labels plus routes. Labels are text. Lives in a databases have read/write costs and latency. So you ask, what's the cheapest way to keep labels fresh, the fastest way to route, the minimal schema that still answers where is it? We priced disk, bandwidth, and human cleanup like bolts in a bin, and the product fell out of the math. Payments looked different, but decomposed the same. A transaction sounded ceremonial vaults, marble lobbies, a calendar of bank holidays. He redrew it as state change over a network. Identity, authorization, clearing, settlement, packets and ledgers. Which parts must be slow, finality, and which parts are only slow because someone's mainframe is. If identity can be cached, authorization can be instantaneous. If risk is modeled, limits can float. The interface is money that moves like email. The implementation is a stack that treats fees as friction to be engineered down. Rockets, oddly, were the clearest. Payload is kilograms, orbit is delta V, cost is dollars per newton and per weld. Engines deliver thrust structures, deliver margins, software delivers guidance. Industry standards said buy the rocket like a cathedral, custom, sacred, ruinously expensive. First principles said buy metal, fuel, sensors, actuators designed for manufacturability, iterate until $/kg bends. Tradition told stories about heritage, physics told us where the mass actually sat. This lens made him allergic to precedent for its own sake. If a constraint wasn't in the equation's material limits, thermals, balance sheets, it was negotiable. If it was in the equations, negotiation ended. That was the setting on his life. Reduce, recompute, rebuild. First principles didn't stop at engines and schemas, they wrapped around charters and chairs. If a company is a machine that turns ideas into cash, governance is the guidance computer inputs, weights, and override authority. After Zip 2, he started decomposing control the same way he decomposed maps, atoms, interfaces, failure modes. Atoms, board seats, officer titles, classes of stock, protective provisions, covenants, interfaces, who sets the agenda, who hires and fires, who can sell the company at 2 a.m. with a unanimous consent memo. Failure modes, you're airborne, the telemetry looks fine, and then a quorum elsewhere with different incentives votes to change the vector mid-flight. PayPal burned the lesson in with a brander's flourish. While he was in the air on a honeymoon, the board reweighted the control surfaces. New CEO, new priorities, same mission printed in a different font. He didn't dramatize it, he disassembled it. Which variables had made the coup mechanically possible? Too many independent directors with soft ties to the money, protected provisions that protected everyone but the person doing the 3 a.m. pied your rotations. Common stock that felt like a participation trophy once preferred showed up with terms and teeth. He mapped it all like a circuit. Add a director here, you add resistance. Split a voting class. You introduce noise. Spread ownership too evenly, and every hard decision becomes a committee seance. From then on, cap tables looked like engineering drawings. Keep the mass centered. Reduce failure paths. Build redundancy where it matters. Cache, hiring, launch windows, and single-point control where it matters more. Course corrections. The question sharpened to a cliff. What if he built companies where he could never be outvoted again?
Chapter 3. Rising Action.
The détente between X.com and Confinity was signed on a Wednesday and contested by Thursday. Publicly, we called it a merger. Privately, it felt like a demilitarized zone patrolled by product managers. 2 logos shared a hallway, 2 code bases shared nothing. Our pagers vibrated like trapped bees, fraud spikes, auth hiccups, password resets in languages none of us spoke. Someone taped a truce line down the middle of a conference table. Someone else moved it 3 inches overnight. We argued in stacked windows. Java versus C++, brand blue versus brand teal, PayPal as a noun versus X as a verb. He wanted velocity and a cathedral interface, clean, inevitable. Confinity arrived with a temple of cryptography and scars to match. At midnight, the flame wars were almost affectionate. By 2 a.m., they weren't. Risk models clashed with conversion funnels. Escrow purists sparred with growth pirates over a button label. A single word could move millions of dollars or lose them. The pager would ping and a thread would end with pushing fix, and then we'd wait to see if the graph twitched up or bled. Every ship was a referendum. He would materialize in a doorway like a summoned variable. What's the constraint? What's the experiment? And the room would pivot from grievance to design. Smaller forms, clearer error states, fewer steps to money. We learned to prototype with live ammo. Limited rollouts at 3 a.m., rollback scripts waiting like parachutes. Speed bred paranoia, but the useful kind. We printed dashboards and taped them to the fridge. We kept a living blacklist of phrases never to use in customer emails. We built an internal wiki called Oracles with 2 columns. Things we believe and things the data killed. The truce held because shipping settled arguments faster than consensus ever could. Momentum didn't come from peace, it came from measurable wins that made the next war unnecessary. The coup didn't come with brass bands, it arrived as a calendar invite I almost declined. Subject line, emergency alignment. He was somewhere between continents on a honeymoon flight, unreachable, the phone tree looping into voicemail. Around the table, smiles were careful and papers were crisp. The motion was short, the language antiseptic: stabilize leadership, reduce volatility, accelerate trust with regulators and banks. When the vote closed, the vector had changed. Thiel's name slid into the CEO cell, ours slid into new boxes that looked suspiciously like the old ones minus gravity. We walked out into Palo Alto sun that felt too bright for the hour. Later that night, his email landed from an airport lounge, curt, unsentimental, already disassembling the mechanism that made the ambush possible. He didn't curse them, he audited us. Where were the fail-safes? Why could a quorum adjust thrust while the pilot was off headset? The scar didn't scab over it, rewired him. Meetings got shorter, notes got sharper, and every governance choice grew a throttle. When eBay came sniffing, he didn't posture. He ran a spreadsheet, network effects we'd never cheaply buy, fraud vectors we'd fight for years, a runway of lawsuits and partnerships that would turn our stack into chewing gum. The price wasn't a finish line, it was an exchange rate fuel for hard problems. In the war room, he drew 2 columns, keep and build. Under keep, he wrote almost nothing. Under build, he wrote the same word 3 times, rockets. Then, smaller, as if testing the weight of it, cars. Money in his mouth was Delta V. The deal was not an exit. It was stage separation. T3 wasn't shorthand for drama. It was math with teeth. 3 consecutive Falcon 1 failures meant 3 strikes against everything that keeps a young company alive: cash, confidence, and credibility. After the first loss, people brought cupcakes and said learning. After the second, vendors started asking for prepay and Net 7 turned into wire before ship. After the third, even friends spoke in pastel tones and asked about options. Engineers don't scare easy, but calendars do. Our burn chart kinked downward, and the whiteboard circle hardened from gallows humor into a constraint as real as mass. A 4th attempt wasn't a narrative beat, it was the last coin in the dish by the door. Compounding is the part outsiders miss. Failure doesn't land as a single thud, it echoes. Morale dips, which slows iteration, which spokes investors, which tightens supplier terms, which eats runway, which forces shortcuts, which raises risk. PR prints the echoes, candidates read the clips, your next recruit decides to stay where the coffee is free and the headlines aren't sharp. We could model the loop on a napkin. Each cycle degraded a variable we needed to recover the others. The sign had flipped negative. TEE. 4 would flip it back or zero it out. Orbit would not only validate the vehicle, it would reprice our risk. 1 clean ascent would reset vendor terms, restore candidate appetite, and reopen phones that had gone politely silent. The 4th flight was a hinge because the market, investors, suppliers, talent needs a binary. After 3, you're folklore. After 4, you're a platform. That was the wager humming behind every checklist and valve test. Change the sign, and everything that compounds against you begins to compound for you.
Exhibit number 2. Exhibit number 2 is a single sheet rescued from a recycle bin and flattened under a stack of vendor invoices. Letterhead at the top, legalese in the middle, and then the part that never stops buzzing. A line that once read in tidy serif type, CEO transition, effective immediately. The phrase is there and not there, printed then mauled by a pen that pressed so hard it left a furrow. You can still see the ghost of each letter under the hatch marks, like bones under an X-ray. In the margin, someone wrote "hold" and then circled it, as if a circle could slow a vote. From 10 feet, it looks like office trivia. From 10 inches, it's a wiring diagram. Memos are guidance computers in disguise. Who drafts, who redlines, who initials, who prints, who brings it into the room. This one tells you where authority actually lives, not in the title block, but in the hand that can cross out a sentence and make reality wait. We kept the page in a sleeve because it wasn't just evidence, it was a lesson plan. The same way we priced valves and welds, we'd begun to price signatures and quorums. Crossed out by whom? The caption asks. You already know the silhouette from earlier. Smiles careful, papers crisp, a calendar invite you almost decline. We'll name the hand around minute 40, and you'll understand why, afterward, he treated pens like throttles. Chapter 4. Peak.
By mid-2007, the optimism had a cough. SpaceX felt like a half-built bridge in a rising tide Tesla, like a prototype living on caffeine and promissory notes. He stopped pretending to go home. A sleeping bag appeared under a conference table and then migrated to the factory floor, where epoxy met concrete and the night air tasted faintly of coolant. Morning stand-ups bled into midnight triage. Someone kept a running list on the whiteboard titled Friday Problems, but we all knew the headline was singular: payroll. On Thursdays, the CFO would hover over a spreadsheet like a cardiologist, moving payables down a week, calling vendors to re-baseline terms, asking who could tolerate a partial. Vendors who once sent cupcakes now wanted wires before ship. The friendlier ones asked for a personal guarantee in the voice you use with relatives. He wired, often. At Tesla, the Roadster's birth plan read, like a crossword: gearbox revisions, battery module scrums, suppliers allergic to our timelines. We celebrated dyno runs and then, 2 hours later, priced the fix for a harness that ran too hot in summer. Euphoria had been a room where every graph pointed up. Denial was the same room with the axes relabeled. We're fine, someone would say, while drafting a note to a landlord about a sublease and looking up whether fine had an accounting definition. He spoke in simple clauses, the way you do when every extra word costs runway. Ship the part. Test the pack. Don't miss Friday. Phones became metronomes, collections, concessions, candidates slipping, reporters asking if we'd comment on rumors we hadn't heard yet. The visible cracks weren't dramatic, they were textured. A vendor badge that stopped opening the gate, a recruiter who stopped returning calls, a team lead who started carrying a second phone so one could die without taking down the day. The mood narrowed from vision to math. We were learning, in public, how close the line sits between audacity and arithmetic and how quickly it moves when the circle on the wall reads T3. The squeeze didn't announce itself, it accreted. Terms that once read net 30 turn net 7, then wire before ship, then we're pausing new POs until the press settles down. One headline about cash burn could move 3 conversations sideways by lunch. A supplier forwarded it with a quick check-in, an investor asked for additional comfort, and a candidate who'd verbally accepted wrote a very polite essay about stability. PR chilled the money, chilled PR. You could watch the temperature drop on the dashboard's pipeline in gray, hiring in gray, the little green dots that meant parts in transit turning neutral because a freight company wouldn't load the crate without a payment reference number we didn't yet have. Investors started referencing optionality, a word that means yes and no at the same time. They wanted progress updates with the cadence of telemetry, then suggested we pace communication so the market wouldn't misread urgency as distress. That advice made perfect sense on paper and 0 sense to a gearbox with tolerance creep. We split time like kindling. Mornings for vendors, afternoons for build issues, evenings for bridge calls, nights for the spreadsheet whose margins had become a cliff. The runway line didn't descend, it frayed. One thread for payroll, one for inventory, one for the week you survive, because a landlord likes rockets and lets you slide. What held was smaller than vision and stronger than policy. Muscle memory. Habits built under fluorescent light: write the test, run the test, update the board, call the shop, own the miss, ship the fix. Mission filled the cracks between tasks and a few stubborn promises: no one misses Friday, the launch window is real, T3 doesn't get the last word acted like rivets. We weren't inspired, we were attached. Sometimes that's what endurance actually is. The Monday call sheet landed at 6:01 a.m., like weather. Agenda lines read: clean vendors, pack tests, pad readiness, but the only instruction that mattered never appeared in text: don't say the word fourth. We called it the next launch, the window, the attempt. People edited themselves mid-syllable, lips skidding around a number the building had decided was flammable. By 9, the phone slowed from constant to occasional to off. Reporters stopped fishing, investors stopped advising, even friendly suppliers discovered meetings they couldn't move. Silence is a tell. It means everyone's waiting to be told what happened to them. We staged for the war room like it was church chairs reset, cables coiled, the CRT that refused to die, wiped with a microfiber that left a constellation of lint. Someone taped over the old whiteboard circle and left a smaller one next to it, like a pupil dilating. In conversation, verbs shortened, wide sent. Crate landed. Valve swapped. We moved as if the adverbs could set something alight. Around lunch, a junior PM asked softly, "Do we acknowledge?" and stopped. He didn't have to finish. We all heard the missing digit. He nodded once, learning the rhythm. The closer you get to ignition, the less language you spend. Afternoon drifted into the amber hour, when fluorescent light overrules the sun. The AC clicked off the room, remembered every previous countdown at once. It felt like a throat clearing. We took our places. Breathing, for now, remained optional.
Chapter 5. Mechanism. Part B.
Failure, operationally, isn't a cliff, it's a slope with sand on it. First, runway. Burn rate is just calories, per day salaries, rent, parts, freight subtracted from a pantry that only refills when someone wires in belief. Miss a milestone and the pantry shrinks faster, miss 2 and you start eating tomorrow's groceries. Second, suppliers. They don't read our hearts, they read our terms. A nervous headline downgrades you from net 30 to net 7 to wire before ship. And every tick forward pulls cash to the front of the month, starving the back. Third, the loop. Bad press makes investors make vendors cautious, vendors slip your schedules, produce bad press. You can diagram it with arrows or feel it in your inbox, either way, it closes on you. The only way out is to inject a counter signal big enough to flip the sign proof, not prose. One clean launch, one deliverable that lands on time and holds torque spec, and suddenly the same loop runs in reverse. Vendors loosen, investors lean in, candidates return your calls. We learn to treat reputation like fuel pressure, measured, regulated, catastrophic if you let it cavitate. Years later, when production hell stopped being a quip and became a calendar entry, the pattern felt familiar at a different scale. Robots jammed at tolerances humans forgive, humans fatigued at cadences robots love, headlines harvested, every jam and drip fed it back into financing costs and supplier confidence. The fix wasn't poetry, it was physics and queuing theory to bottleneck the cell, rebalance human/robot work, pay down quality debt like interest. Same loop, new factory. The lesson traveled. If you can't break the feedback, you become the feedback. It wasn't an intern with a Sharpie. It was the same faction that had replaced him mid-flight at PayPal. Careful smiles, crisp papers, a talent for using process like a torque wrench. They were the ones who drafted CEO transition effective immediately, and they were the ones who pressed the pen hard enough to leave a groove when effective immediately suddenly needed to wait. Payoff #2 lands there. Once you've watched a quorum change thrust while you're off comms, you stop treating governance as stationary. You treat it like avionics. From that scar, he wrote an iron doctrine. Titles weren't ornaments, they were authority surfaces. CEO/CTO/chief designer wasn't resume padding, it was a routing table. Voting wasn't a courtesy, it was math agreements that bundled proxies, consent rights concentrated where course corrections live, thresholds set so that stability couldn't be weaponized into stasis. Boards became fewer hops, tighter loops, directors who understood that risk is a vector, not a feeling, meetings where agenda time mirrored the physics of the week. Decision funnels were redesigned like flow control. Single-threaded owners, escalation paths with one valve at the end, reviews that terminated in "do this" rather than "let's circle back." At SpaceX, the private cap table behaved like a fly-by-wire system, redundant where failure kills you cash, engines range, single point where drift kills you architecture, schedule, final say. At Tesla, the operating truth rhymed even when the paperwork couldn't. Compress debate, assign an owner, ship the part, fix on Friday. He would listen widely, and then narrow, brutally. Consensus was a diagnostic, not a destination. So when the next memo circled a number that could end everything, no one reached for a pen to soften it. The control surfaces were already set. The only vote left was orbit.
Exhibit number 3. Exhibit number 3 isn't a document. It's a temperature. 31 seconds of hallway audio, clipped by a phone that accidentally recorded on its way into a meeting that ran past midnight. You hear carpeted footsteps. A door hinge protest. Then his voice, flat as a torque spec. Hardcore or out. There's no roar, no drum roll, just policy delivered like physics. Listen again and you'll catch the reply that isn't one. A breath pulled in and held, sneakers scraping as someone chooses silence over argument. We kept the file not because the words were novel, but because the ambient told the story. Fluorescent hum, tired laughter swallowed whole. A calendar notification chiming, and no one reaching to dismiss it. The clip sets the thermostat for later, when the company that carried his initial would inherit his cadence. Hardcore becomes a unit of time, of sleep surrendered, of friendships taxed. The bet is speed, the currency is people. The burn rate is measured in birthdays missed. In the archive, we tagged the audio with 2 labels, velocity and attrition. Both proved accurate. We'll meet the cost around minute 60, when a mentee we both claimed as ours stops answering texts, then emails, then anything. For now, hold the hallway in your ears, the hum, the scrape, the clause with only 2 exits. And remember that culture is just repeated sentences with payroll attached. Chapter 6. The Edge of the Turn.
Our mentee bright, stubborn, a human accelerant was stationed at a gearbox supplier 2 time zones away, sleeping on a foam pad between a torque bench and a parts cage. The plan was 2 days to stabilize yield. Day 4, he FaceTimed me from under a light that made everyone look dehydrated. "We can hold spec at 20 an hour if we babysit the fixture," he said, voice rasped to wire. 20 wasn't enough. Tesla's margin math punished anything shy of flow. Every hour of shortfall migrated into a spreadsheet cell that turned green to yellow to a color the CFO didn't name. I told him to send a second shift. He sent a shrug. There wasn't one. He had become the second shift. On my end, the phone buzzed with a family call. I couldn't take birthday candles. A chorus of "Where are you?" pressed into voicemail. I watched the transcription render and then disappear as another number lit the screen. A vendor who'd love to help if we could wire a small assurance. At the factory, a pallet of cells idled because a forklift was shared with a neighbor who suddenly needed it for an hour. At SpaceX, pad prep was a checklist that felt like a prayer we'd written ourselves. All of it, concurrent. We triage by physics, fix what unblocks motion, defer what only bruises feelings. Accept that feelings will be bruised. He pinged again. Fixture drifted. Re-zeroed. Back to 19. I typed 3 words, call it, escalate, and didn't hit send, because I knew what escalation meant, pulling him off the line and letting throughput sag, or leaving him there and watching a person become a process step. The room around me was quiet in that way that means nothing is actually still. We were juggling grenades with pins already loose. We reset to the ritual. Same room as the cold open. Same screen that makes distance feel near and mercy feel small. Chairs slide in on felt feet. Someone kills the overhead so the CRT owns the wall. The whiteboard with its taped-over circle throws a pale rectangle like a ghost of the number we still don't say. Laptops close not respect, triage. Phones face down in a row, flashlight lenses like blank eyes. Elon takes the edge of the table again, hands spread the way you steady a ladder. We review the checklist not because we can change any line, but because reading it aloud makes it real enough to obey. Range green, winds nominal, valve swap verified. The words are thin rails we hold. Breathing syncs up without a conductor. The room learns, as it always does, to spend fewer syllables per minute the closer the digits march. A comms crackle. A voice we know by grain more than name reads out a number that could be weather or fate. Heads tilt, no one nods. Somewhere, condensation ticks in the AC duct. Somewhere else, a pen clicks twice and stops. On screen, the pad camera adjusts, the vehicle centered as if the frame itself were praying for symmetry. The clock sheds seconds with a polite indifference. We are a throat before a word, a finger over a send key, a body leaning past balance but not yet falling. Then the number changes again, closer, and the room becomes a held breath with furniture.
Chapter 7. The Crash Climax.
The room tilts at T0 like a ship catching swell. Ignition washes the speakers in a ragged roar, pixels bloom, and the pad camera stutters as heat makes the air visible. Someone whispers roll program out of habit, not need. The vehicle climbs clean, a white thread unspooling off a black spool, the flame so bright the feed resolves it as geometry. Callouts come in pairs altitude, velocity each syllable a rung we step onto and refuse to look down from. Mexico. The word lands in the room like a throat clearing. Structure holds. The quiver in the image sobers, then settles. The sound drops from thunder to a disciplined howl. You can feel wrists loosen by millimeters. Mecco. The screen flickers, our hearts do the same, then stage sep snaps into view, a silver coin spinning away, a brief glitter of severed hardware followed by a second stage ignition that looks, at this resolution, like a fuse catching. The vector steadies. Telemetry threads into numbers we know by muscle memory, angles, temps, margins, and each one returns from the dark like a student you were sure had dropped the class. Faring off a puff, a shrug, the sky swallowing old constraints. The voice on comms reads parameters in a tone you could set a watch to. The line on the plot, so often a prelude to apology, refuses to kink. Silence changes flavor. It was dread, now it's concentration taxed to interest. A chair creaks, and no one glares. The AC breathes. Elon doesn't move his hands from the table, he just starts to use them again, small taps that pace the seconds. We ride the burn. Guidance calls nominal. Range stays green like it has always in fact been green. The last checklist box waits, coy, Seco. The word is small, almost embarrassed by its consequence. Then, orbit. No flourish, no symbol, crash, just a coordinate and a speed that add up to. We are not coming back down. The room doesn't cheer, it detonates. Sound returns first, palms on plywood. A barked laugh that turns into something wetter than gravity returns to our lungs. Shoulders drop, eyes shine, a pen finally clatters to the floor from a hand that forgot it existed. The probabilistic ghost that had been standing behind each of us steps out through the wall without bothering the door. We are, for the first time in a very long time, on the right side of the math. After orbit, the phones forgot how to be shy. The first rings were congratulations that doubled as due diligence, huge news, quick question about lead times, and then the real pivot arrived like a clean ledger line. NASA cargo award, $1. 6B of oxygen in contract form. You could feel the sign flip in the building. Vendors who yesterday needed wire before ship rediscovered net 30. A freight company that wouldn't load a crate without a payment reference number now offered a Saturday truck and a favor. Insurance ran the same math we did. Risk repriced, premiums drifted down. Recruiters who'd ghosted us due to market volatility were suddenly in the neighborhood. Inside, the change was subtler and deeper. We stopped selling possibility and started scheduling obligations. A manifest is a promise you can touch. Bet became backlog. The same dashboards we'd taped to fridges picked up new columns. Flights, milestones, penalties. Engineers smiled at that last word. Penalties mean you're in a league that keeps score. The cadence of meetings shifted from if to when. He drew a box around platform on the whiteboard and underlined it twice. A platform isn't a story, it's an interface with customers who plan holidays around you, burn windows. Suppliers began bringing their teams to site visits. Their RFQs included phrases like strategic terms instead of pause. Candidates with other offers asked if they could start early. The landlord who liked rockets liked them even more. Under the hum of new money, we heard an older rhythm returning. Write the test, run the test, ship on Friday. 1 ascent had rethreaded the loop we'd been snared in. The same compounding that once ate runway now minted it. The room that had measured silence learned a new unit. Throughput. We were no longer a coin toss. We were infrastructure. Smash cut. The Roadster's audacity turns into a sedan that looks like it snuck out of a wind tunnel wearing a tux. Model S lands with safety scores that bend the chart and a design halo bright enough to light every showroom within driving distance. We felt the world tip a few degrees. Journalists who once filed us under quirk now argued over adjectives customers learned to say over the air without flinching. Then came the three, the people's spaceship, order sheets stacked like poker chips, deposits turning our balance sheet into a waiting room. On paper, demand was solved. In metal, demand is choreography. We built a cathedral to robots and discovered they pray to cycle time, not to hope. A carbon fiber wrist missed a pick by 2 millimeters and turned an hour into a day. A vision system caught a reflection and mistook it for a part of conveyor with perfect uptime, on a demo day decided to practice mortality at 3 a.m. Humans forgive robots jam. He walked the line with a yellow pad and a permanent frown that read like focus. Too clever, he said, tapping a cell where two automatons tried to hand off a harness with the grace of drunk uncles. The expensive humility followed. De-automate, re-automate, right size. We pulled gates, added torque wrenches, hired people with wrists that could feel tolerance drift before the gauges did. The spreadsheet hated the decision and the short-term labor up. CapEx stranded, but the cars started flowing. We moved inspection upstream, broke monolith stations into cells, let humans solve edge cases, and trained robots on what stayed boring. Quality debt got paid down like interest, the painful way. One fix per Friday, 1,000 Fridays in a row. Headlines called it production hell, which was fair. What they missed was the lesson we'd already learned on a pad half a world away. You don't argue with physics, you renegotiate with it. We changed the line mid-run, bled margin for schedule, and bought back credibility with throughput. The factory, insulted into wisdom, began to purr. Smash cut again, this time not to a factory but to a timeline. The term sheet hit like a siren $44B, a number with its own weather system, and then bodies moved. Bankers in navy suits, lawyers in black commas, engineers refreshing a code base that would soon have a new root user. Overnight, badges stopped blinking. A message went out that read like a breaker thrown. Access rescinded. Reapply if essential. Floors empty between sunrise and lunch. Meeting rooms that had hosted culture committees became triage bays for uptime and abuse queues. He walked in with a backpack and two rules that fit on one napkin. Ship velocity, reduce surface area. The stack was a snarl legacy features that talked past each other, moderation policies that accreted like barnacles, ad systems grafted to content systems with duct tape and prayer. He wanted an interface he could throttle and a machine that behaved like a single idea. Rebrand to X wasn't cosmetics, it was a declaration. Subtract baggage, widen ambition. The logo changed, so did the verbs. Subscriptions appeared like bolts. Then payments peered around the door. He'd been sketching the money that moves like email loops since X.com, and now he had a megaphone large enough to test it in public. The moderation thermostat swung and the building learned, again, that knobs are politics. Advertisers flinched, some left, a few returned with stipulations that read like treaties. APIs were repriced, rate limits walked, and then ran. Algorithms got hauled into daylight like engines on stands. The org chart compressed until decisions fit in a hallway. Hardcore left the server room and moved into HR. People called it chaos, he called it consolidation. If rockets reprice physics and EVs reprice oil, this was an attempt to reprice speech. Own the room where the world argues, and the cost of distribution collapses to the cost of electricity and courage. The debt service clock ticked, the user graph twitched, advertisers measured sentiment with rulers made of glass. He kept reaching for the same tool, first principles with a bullhorn. A platform, in his telling, was not a brand, it was infrastructure you could route your life through. Owning it meant the guidance computer sat under his palm. Payoff #3 arrived without sirens. Our mentee, the one in the hallway, audio's shadow stopped answering the late pings first, then the noon ones, then all of them. His badge still opened doors, he just stopped walking through them. A manager found him in a quiet room staring at a torque chart that wasn't his anymore. I'm fine, he said, the way a battery says it at 2%. Hardcore had done what hardcore always does when the thermostat sticks. It annealed the metal and warped the person. HR offered a sabbatical shaped like mercy. He took a chair and then never came back to it. I sent him a text with 2 words, proud. Stop. And watched it turn blue, then inert. That is the cost embedded in the clip. A culture forged to move mass will also move people past their elastic limit. The platform scaled, a person didn't. Payoff #4 was a number with weather. 44. Not a boast, a bill. 44 billion is how much it cost to own the microphone, to swap influence by persuasion for influence by root access. It bought latency control on speech policy knobs within reach, dials on distribution, and replaced soft power with a ledger entry that accrues interest every midnight. 44 also priced the solitude of command. Advertisers convert feelings into line items, regulators convert headlines into hearings, your cash flow converts principal into payroll. If rockets reprice physics and EVs reprice oil, 44 was the price of repricing the public square, making it personal infrastructure. The debt clock didn't blink, neither did he. There was, later, another number that rhymed but cut differently, 56, A Delaware decision voiding a compensation package with more zeros than oxygen tanks, less about cash in the drawer than about jurisprudence around control. Courts, unlike markets, don't care about velocity graphs. They read minutes and measure loyalty and fiduciary duty, not launch cadence. He could tighten every guidance loop inside the building and still find a room he didn't command. Mahogany table, careful smiles, pens with jurisdiction. Numbers are neutral. They add, they subtract, they circle back, which is why our archive keeps receipts. The next one has a seal.
Exhibit number 4. Exhibit number 4 is a photocopied page with a seal at the top and an arithmetic bruise in the middle. Delaware, Chancery font, paragraphs stacked like bricks. You don't need to read every clause to feel the verdict. Your eye goes straight to the circle someone drew in blue pen around a figure that starts with a 5 and keeps going. Ink dug in hard enough to ghost the next sheet. The caption we taped beneath it reads, "Numbers don't care how famous you are. Courts don't either. Where markets express opinion in price, this room speaks in orders, pages, signatures. A date that turns debate into precedent. It isn't a morality play. It's a ledger. Fiduciary duty on one side, consideration on the other. A balance resolved by people who don't attend launch parties." We kept the page the way machinists keep a bent bolt. Proof of tolerance succeeded. It paired neatly with vendor terms and burn charts. Another reminder that myth can move headlines but not margins, not covenants, not the line where approval thresholds live. In our archive, the sheet sits between a vendor invoice and a launch manifest like a joke only accountants tell. Rockets, cars, speech, all of it eventually routes through math. Circle a number. It circles back.
Chapter 8. Aftermath and Reflection.
The blast radius wasn't an explosion so much as a climate. Some people learned to breathe the new air and stayed. They liked the thinness decisions traveling fast, ambiguity vacuumed out, the scoreboard always lit. They wore the hours like armor and said hard things are hard with a shrug that sounded like faith. Others stepped back, quietly, like astronauts who discover their suits don't seal anymore. A lead who could will a line to move realized willing a marriage to survive was different physics. A savant for failure analysis grew allergic to weekends that arrived pre-broken. Our mente didn't come back, his badge worked, his eyes didn't. We sent him ship notes anyway, small postcards from a life still sprinting. Inside, chairs reshuffled. The ones closest to him either grew calluses or blisters. Proximity gave you voltage and burns in the same pulse. You learned to translate his sentences. "We can do better" as a design spec. "This is unacceptable" as a calendar correction. The people who lasted were converters. Heat into motion, criticism into edits, fear into checklists. The people who left weren't weak. They were choosing different math. We tried to square the ledger. Gifts on the asset side, rockets that made orbit cheap enough for new science to hitch a ride, cars that turned tailpipe into software, a network above clouds that made far places less far. Costs on the other column, birthdays surrendered to burn charts, teams annealed past elasticity, a culture that could widen the future and narrow a life. In review, the paradox held. He dragged tomorrow into today and charged interest. We stood in the afterglow and the shadow at once, holding both truths like tools we'd never learned to put down. The macro graph tilts. EV adoption stops being a novelty S-curve and starts behaving like infrastructure, charging dots, spreading across maps until range anxiety looks like a story you told your parents. Municipal fleets flip, apartment garages add outlets like fire code, and used markets appear where skeptics swore there'd be only dead batteries. The knock-on effects compound. Utilities model load with software instead of superstition. Oil demand forecasts acquire a stutter high school shop classes teach, can bust sniffing alongside torque specs. Upstairs in the other industry, reusability makes orbit feel less like a gala and more like a schedule. Boosters scuff, land and fly again, $/kg slides from only nations to also startups. Payload ideas multiply because ideation isn't strangled by launch scarcity anymore. A lab that once mailed DNA now books a ride share. Earth observation turns from postcards to video. Then there's the constellation satellite internet turned into a mesh with its own geopolitics. Rural school buses become rolling hotspots, fishing boats. File catch reports from latitudes that used to be rumors. In a blackout, a dish on a balcony restores a street. In a war, a dish on a balcony becomes a target. Regulators argue with astronomers about sky glow, defense ministries argue with latency, autocrats argue with the idea that routing tables can ignore borders. Infrastructure is never neutral once it works, but if the curves point up, the bones underneath still feel the load. Burnout doesn't file 10Ks, it just logs out. Online culture wars reroute through the same pipes we built for software updates and launch streams, and every policy knob turns into a referendum no spreadsheet can resolve. Lawsuits accumulate like gasket kits, employment, securities, contracts, each consuming oxygen that once fed machines. We stand in a world materially altered by first principles, cheaper orbit, quieter streets, signal in the blank places, and discover that the ledger remains double entry. Progress credits one column, the other bills in hours, headlines in courts. The trick, if there is one, is to keep the asset from forgetting the liability. You can bend physics. People bend back. That's the lesson written between the lines of every launch, manifest, and sprint plan. Thrust scales with fuel, humans don't scale with slogans. Willpower management works for a night, maybe a quarter. Beyond that, it becomes debt with compounding interest paid in trust, then talent, then institutional memory. We learned that hardcore is an engineering setting, not a lifestyle. You can spec it for a phase bring up, debug, a window you must make, but if you leave the dial pinned, the system finds a way to protect itself. It quits, it quiet quits, it follows a recruiter home. Culture, we discovered, is also an engineered system. Input, stories, rituals, who gets praised, control loops, how fast truth travels, how safely dissent routes, failure modes, fear, flattery, secrecy. If you don't design it on purpose, it self-assembles out of deadlines and whatever the highest status person does when no one is looking. He still believes that reality yields to those who refuse to stop turning the wrench. Often, gloriously, he's right. But people aren't alloys, they're ecosystems. They don't accept new loads just because the math balances. They need slack in the line, recovery after the burn, the psychological equivalent of cryo cooldowns. Trust is non-fungible. Once you fracture it, you can't patch in a replacement from inventory. You earn it in tiny increments, consistent Fridays kept, criticisms delivered with context, apologies issued before the lawyer drafts a statement, and you lose it at machine speed. The quiet capital of any enterprise is belief. That promise is mapped to outcomes, that the scoreboard is honest, that the person holding the pen will also hold the bill. We built machines to change the world. To keep them running, we had to remember the world inside the machines. We price rockets in cars. Value is the part that rides home with you. It's the silence in a driveway when a parent realizes the garage no longer smells like gasoline. It's the ping of a village hospital satellite link coming back after a storm. It's a kid in a backseat asking why the world got quieter and you having a good answer. We learned to count that kind of value badly at first because spreadsheets don't subtotal wonder or sleep recovered or arguments avoided. Eventually, we started adding new cells, emissions not made, minutes not wasted at pumps, homework uploaded from the far edge of a map. We subtracted 2, birthdays missed, friendships thinned by sprint after sprint, the mental tax of living at T-. The ledger didn't resolve, it clarified. When he said engineering can save civilization, he meant the visible column dollars per kilogram, miles per kilowatt hour, latency shaved off a continent. Standing beside him, I came to believe the invisible column is equally real. Trust per meeting, safety per design review, dignity per policy. If the first column is thrust, the second is guidance. Lose either, and you tumble. So the accounting I carry forward is blunt and human. Price the steel and the code and the debt, also price the marriages that survived, the teams that didn't, the apprentices who turned into architects because someone let them sleep. We still chase deltas. We just measure where they land.
From the quiet capital stacks, we close the folder and leave a thumbprint on its edge. The friend whose voice carried us through plywood rooms, factory air, and boardroom oxygen has long since stepped back from the blast zone. He didn't keep the badge. He kept the belief that launches, lines of code, and bolts torqued to spec can tilt the future a visible degree. He also kept something rarer, the caution that machines change the world only when the people building them can go home whole. In our archive, his notes end where most stories try to swell. His last margin scribble reads like a checklist for civilization. Make it work. Make it safe. Make it worth it. We file the exhibits in their sleeves, T3 circled, a memo scarred, a hallway clipped, a quartz arithmetic bruise, and we resist the tidy epilogue. Numbers will keep adding. Rockets will keep landing. Factories will keep learning to speak in throughput. Somewhere, a mentee is sleeping again. Somewhere else, a new one is taping a graph to a fridge. The work continues, as work insists on doing. If there's a benediction here, it's plain. Engineering widens what's possible when it remembers who it is for. When guidance respects the humans who ride the thrust, the future arrives not as spectacle, but as infrastructure. From our archive to your hands, that's the record. From our room to yours, rest easy.